Something else not for the first time being said on this channel. This comes from the Sunday Times, and especially given last week's, shall we say, performance. Um, yeah, what's wrong, Brexiteers? I thought the EU needed us more than we needed them. Once more, that maxim is not being proven true at all. So, this again from the Sunday Times, and it's Britain's leaders did not understand the value of EU rules and still don't. By far the most jaw-dropping revelation so far to have emerged in the extracts from David Cameron's memoirs was buried in his account of the build-up to the Brexit referendum. Recalling his efforts to persuade Johnson to back Remain, the former Prime Minister noted that Boris had become fixated on whether we could pass legislation that said UK law was ultimately supreme over EU law. He duly dispatched Sir Oliver Letwin on a nightmare round of shuttle diplomacy between Mr. Johnson and the government's lawyer to see if there was a way that could be found to address his concerns by domestic legislation. But those lawyers were determined to defend the purity of European law and kept watering down the wording. According to Mr. Cameron, this epitomised the problem at the heart of the UK's relationship with the EU. Our officials were determined to play by the rules. What makes this extract extraordinary is that it confirms that 6 years after he became Prime Minister, and just weeks before he gambled Britain's membership of the EU in a referendum, that he didn't understand how it works. Indeed, it appears that he still hasn't grasped that the supremacy of EU law in areas over which the EU has compliance is not a bug, but an essential feature which without it, it couldn't work. It was the purity of the EU rules and the willingness of member states to play strictly by them that has enabled open borders and frictionless trade across the continent. Without common rules and consistency enforced by a common court, the customs union and single market in whose defence Mr. Cameron sacrificed his political career would not exist. His ignorance of the fundamental principles of how the EU operates is testimony to the enduring hold of one of the most powerful narratives in British politics: the idea that rules are for other people, and that the EU's insistence on the integrity of its legal order is alien and unnecessary continental obsession. And it continues to hold an unshakable grip over a large swathe of Britain's political class. Despite all that has happened over the past 3 years, Theresa May suffered from the same delusion, proclaiming in her notorious speech on October 2016 in the Conservative Party conference that she would end the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice in Britain, apparently oblivious to the fact that she had just committed herself to taking Britain out of the EU single market and customs union until this was pointed out by Sir Ivan Rogers, Britain's then ambassador to the EU. She spent the next 2.5 years being schooled in legal reality. Now Boris Johnson is Prime Minister, and the whole cycle has started again. He took office in July, apparently determined to test the narrative to destruction, insisting that by threatening to leave the EU without a deal on October 31st, he could convince Brussels to drop its insistence on the purity of EU law and a requirement that everyone play by the rules. Now, with only 43 days to go, we are invited to believe that Mr. Johnson is in fact keen to reach a deal. Yet, from the hazy details that Downing Street has been preparing to reveal so far, there is no sign that the government has been able to identify the legal workable alternative arrangements that would be needed to avoid using the Irish backstop in the existing withdrawal agreement. Even if Mr. Johnson were to able to agree that Northern Ireland should remain subject to all EU agricultural rules, or indeed all single market rules for trade in goods, this still wouldn't be enough to replace the backstop without a commitment to common customs area, and aligning it on the VAT border checks would still be necessary. nor is it plausible that the EU would allow the Northern Irish Assembly a veto over new EU rules. What is the issue here is not just the fate of Brexit, but the credibility of the British state. Narratives just don't matter in domestic politics. They matter to markets too. One of the strongest and most enduring market narratives over the many decades is that Britain is a highly stable, well-governed country. Yet, Brexit risks putting that narrative in question. When it is clear that 3 prime ministers in succession have reached the highest office with flawed understanding of how the basic framework underpinning a G7 country's most important commercial and security relationship works, is clear somehow that it has gone profoundly awry in Britain's political system. How can it be that a country with no shortage of expertise in both public and private sector can find itself led by politicians with so little understanding of how the global trading system works? Perhaps Michael Gove spoke more truth than anyone realised when he said during the referendum campaign that Britain had enough of experts. As yet another team of British negotiators heads to Brussels to try and negotiate a new relationship with the EU based on the same misplaced expectations. It seems that Brexit did not so much cause the crisis in the British state as reveal one. That bodes ill regardless of how Brexit plays out in the weeks and months ahead. Xavier Bettel, Luxembourg's Prime Minister, was certainly undiplomatic in his outburst after his meeting with Mr Johnson this week. There was little doubt that his frustration with Britain is widely shared not just across the EU, but a loss of confidence in our political class and institution risks translating in a loss of confidence in Britain generally. The problem is that once the narrative takes hold, it can be very hard to shift, as we have learnt. After all, there is one thing that we can say for sure. Even if Britain does end up leaving the EU without a deal, the reasonable worst-case scenario outlined in the government's Yellowhammer reports turned out to be true. Mr Johnson will never admit that he got it wrong. Like Mr Cameron, he will pin the blame on the lawyers who defended the purity of EU law and insisted by playing by the rules. Can't blame him, and that's exactly what's happened. We got word after Finland and France said, look, we're going to give you 12 days to come up with something. They literally presented the withdrawal agreement, but just with the backstop crossed out. The lack of understanding about the EU is not just at a public level. It seems completely there at a high-level political level as well. And as I said there, this is damaging the UK. This will have ramifications for decades to come. Company, come invest in the UK. I don't think I'm going to invest in the UK because it is not stable and it is not politically viable. I'm going to go over to the continent instead. That will have huge impacts for, again, jobs creation, getting people to come and invest in the UK. And again, we told you this would happen, but once again, you didn't listen. It was, quote, Project Fear. And now you have the own government's reports on Yellowhammer, basically outlining the likely scenarios of what will happen in a no-deal Brexit.